Hi, I'm Dominik Steinhöfel from CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security in Germany, and this is a presentation of our paper Input Invariants that I co-authored together with Andreas Zeller. You will probably recognize this example that I'm using in this talk, the infamous heartbleed vulnerability. Heartbleed was a bug in the implementation of the heartbeat protocol in OpenSSL that caused the leakage of potentially sensitive information to attackers. So how does the heartbeat protocol work? The idea is that a client wants to ask a server whether the server is still alive. And it does so by sending a heartbeat request message to the server. This message consists of a type, which is always 1 for requests, a length specification that describes the number of bytes in the payload, and then the message is concluded by a padding. If the server is indeed still alive, it responds with a heartbeat response message with type 2 and a length and payload field that match the request, and then the message concludes by a random padding again. The vulnerability is exposed if an attacker sends a length field that exceeds the length of the payload and the padding combined. And if then a server with this vulnerability in its code responds to the message, it will simply fetch some bytes from its main memory, which might, for instance, contain your password that is now in the hands of this malicious attacker. Wouldn't it be nice if we detected these bugs, these vulnerabilities before they face the user? And ideally, we would do so by automated software testing. In the simplest case, we can run a black box fuzzing campaign, generating random strings and feeding them to our server. But the problem is that most, if not all of them, will be rejected because they do not at all resemble a valid heartbeat request message. Of course, there are more advanced fuzzing technologies such as mutation-based fuzzing, but also there we need high-quality seed inputs, and also we need a powerful oracle to judge whether or not a response is problematic, since our server does not crash, it simply leaks your password. So the first problem of creating messages that somehow look like what the server expects can be solved by grammar fuzzing. So what you see here is a context-free grammar for the heartbeat request language. And if we now put this into a grammar fuzzer, we only obtain inputs such as this one, which would actually directly trigger the vulnerability if we had a sufficiently powerful oracle to judge that it's the case. The grammar, on the other hand, also generates less interesting inputs, like perfectly valid ones, for instance, also if this is less probable in this scenario. But the question is, what if we only want the malicious ones, right? And the problem is that this property that the integer representation of the length field should equal the number of bytes in the payload is something which is context sensitive and simply cannot be expressed in a context-free grammar. And also there might be additional properties that could be expressed in our grammar, but which would blow it up such that it's no longer nicely readable, or maybe we want to flexibly handle these constraints and add and change and experiment with them. So the question is, can we leave this grammar as it is and impose some constraints on top? And the answer by our paper is that yes, we can, by using our ISLa specification language and tooling. ISLa combines context-free grammars with constraints that are potentially context sensitive. And these constraints talk about the symbols, the non-terminals specified by the grammar. And if there's one thing that you should take away from this talk, is that ISLa is your tool if you want to combine grammars with context-sensitive constraints on top. So before I continue with this talk, let me give you a brief demo of ISLa's capabilities. I already prepared for you the grammar of the heartbeat request message language. I use the Python grammar since there it's easier possible to concisely express what a byte is. And now using this grammar, we can directly generate a syntactically valid heartbeat request message. And since it's really hard to tell whether this is something valid, let's first get a derivation tree instead and pass this to an analysis script that I wrote. And here we see that what the message looks like in hex format. And indeed, here we have a payload length that significantly exceeds the length of our packet. So this would trigger the heartbeat vulnerability. So, but this is something that you could do with any grammar-based fuzzer. So let's do something which only ISLa can do. Let's add a constraint, and I will, as a first example, use the constraint that our padding length should be greater or equal than 16. And this is what we get, a padding field with, in this case, exactly 16 bytes. So, but we came here, of course, for the heartbeat constraint, right? And well, here we have it. This says that the integer representation of our payload length field should equal the length of our payload. And then we also have this requirement that the padding should at least consist of 16 bytes. We can now pass this to our ISLa solver, and to speed things up a little, I will add an additional constraint restricting the length of our payload to, say, 100 bytes at most, since otherwise it might take too long to generate a payload of, say, a million bytes if the SMT solver wants us to do this. And yeah, we see that indeed we have a payload length of 92, and we also get 92 payload bytes. All right, these are some of the things that ISLa can do. There is much more, but unfortunately I don't have the time to explain all this in the demo. So how does ISLa do this? How does the ISLa fuzzer work? The ISLa fuzzer is grammar-based. So what it does is it starts with the start symbol of our grammar, and then step by step uses the grammar expansion rules to expand the current derivation tree that we have here into something more specific. And then if we encounter a non-terminal like padding here that is bound by a constraint like this, then we can ask an SMT solver, for instance C3, which is what we use, to provide us with a solution, and C3 will happily give us a padding field of at least 16 bytes. And then we can finish off the remaining non-terminals that are unconstrained and obtain this input here, satisfying our additional constraint that we added on top of our grammar. So maybe you remember this initial question that I had during the presentation: can we only get such inputs? And the answer is yes, we can. We can do so by using input invariants. An input invariant is a description of a class of inputs sharing common characteristics that we are interested in. For instance, the input invariant valid might encode this property here of valid, not rejected heartbeat request messages. And then we can also have other invariants, for instance, this here, that would trigger the heartbeat exploit. With invariants, we can fuzz, but we can also do more. For instance, we can take an invariant and put into an input checker that now decides whether or not an input is valid, satisfies the invariant, without even calling our OpenSSL server. We can also take a malicious input and repair it, or take any input and mutate it in a way such that the result still satisfies our invariant. Now, if we have multiple inputs and potentially also access to our test target program or a property over its runs, we can also use an input invariant learner to give us an input invariant that describes abstractly the inputs that we fed to the learner. And this is immensely useful, for instance, in automatic debugging, if you want to have a diagnosis that describes the commonalities of failing inputs, and also for regression testing. If we have an invariant for valid inputs in a version of OpenSSL that works, then we can use this to check future versions for regressions. To compare this to alternatives, let's assume that we have a producer of such heartbeat request messages, which can be a really nice testing tool. But on the other hand, it cannot check inputs, it cannot repair or mutate them, and also it cannot mine invariants from existing inputs. We can also not simply go and take this producer to test C programs, whereas for an input invariant-based fuzzer, we can simply exchange the grammar and the constraints and generate C programs without having to exchange the whole fuzzing toolkit. And also, which is maybe even more interesting, we cannot specialize the class of generated inputs towards those that we are particularly interested in, for instance, those that model the exploit that we previously encountered, right? So these are all things that we cannot do with specialized fuzzers and specialized checkers and so on, but which we can do with our ISLa tool that shares its name with our specification language, and ISLearn, which is our invariant learner. If you want to learn more about ISLa and ISLearn, then please have a look into our paper. And if there are any unclarities or questions, then feel free to write me an email at any time. Also, we have an interactive tutorial in the fuzzing book, which is a really nice way to get started with ISLa, and it has a lot of examples and exercises and even a video. So just check this out if you want to use ISLa yourself. We have a lot of future work ideas, and actually a lot of things are going on already right now. A simple idea is to use the ISLa input generator to generate high-quality seed inputs for gray box fuzzing, or maybe even include our mutator directly into a gray box fuzzer. So far, I only talked about input invariants, but what if we also got output invariants and combined them to input-output invariants? This addresses the oracle problem that I mentioned several times in this talk, because now we do not depend on our test target to crash. We can simply take inputs, outputs, compare them, check them against our invariant, and say, okay, here's something that violates our invariant, and we can report a bug to developers. So, and also we can take a running system and encapsulate it in an anomaly detector for reporting or maybe quarantining malicious inputs or dubious outputs. This already concludes my talk. I explained to you what ISLa is. ISLa is your tool to combine grammas with context-sensitive constraints. I briefly sketched how ISLa works and gave a demo. I gave you hints towards our tools and mentioned our interactive tutorial, and also I sketched some of our future work ideas. So if you have any questions, then please, as I said, write me an email. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much.